Hello. So it's been a little while since I made a video, and as promised, I am back. Although my videos might be a little bit slower in coming because I'm spending a little bit more time thinking about them and doing some research. Today's video is inspired mostly by Abundance by Peter Diamandis. Now, it also comes from a lot of other sources, but this book is by far the most concise delivery of a lot of these ideas. And this entire slide deck comes from just one chapter out of this book. And I'm not done with the book yet, so you should expect more to be inspired by this book. I've also been reading, which one is it? It was Ray Kurzweil's Age of Spiritual Machines, which does a really good job of presenting the idea of order versus chaos and why things are accelerating as a way that you can look at it from a mathematical perspective. Now, many of the predictions in that book, some of them are good, some of them not so good, but it's still a very interesting book. I found the first part of Age of Spiritual Machines to be the most interesting because Ray basically talks about how he goes about modeling things in the world and why the singularity is more or less inevitable from a mathematical perspective. And of course, math is better than your gut intuition or your instincts, or your emotions, which is the subject of today's video. So let's get started. Cognitive bias. Everyone has cognitive biases. We all are aware of these cognitive biases. In many cases, cognitive biases were adaptive in the past, meaning that it was basically pure survival. If you had some sort of emotional bias or cognitive bias or whatever, if it helped you survive longer, great, then it stuck around. In other cases, these are shortcuts to save time and energy, time and mental energy. Our brain is incredibly expensive. It's, what is it? It's like 2% of our body mass, but consumes 20% of our energy. Your brain time, your cognitive attention is your scarcest resource other than physical time. Therefore, in order to optimize the use of your brain, it's come up with a lot of shortcuts. And again, this is basically just on pure survival, because if you spend too much time thinking about something, or if it takes too long, then you might miss an opportunity, you might get eaten, whatever. So instead, our brains favor rapid decisions that are based on heuristics or, learned from experience, just shorthand patterns. And again, all based on survival. Now, we can slow down and think through things, but many people are not trained to do this. It's not natural. It's not intuitive. And therefore, and even if you know that you have these cognitive biases, you're going to have other neurobiological failures, such as failures of intuition and failures of emotion, which means that you just cannot trust what your brain tells you about reality, particularly in the world that we live in today. And I'll explain the scope of what I mean in a minute. But another way of thinking about it is that your brain evolved to be local and linear, or local and geometric. And so basically, for the vast majority of human history and proto-human history, before we were even humans, when we were still fish and amphibians and then mammals and apes, pretty much everything that you experienced was within your five senses. If you could see it, hear it, smell it, touch it, it was basically nothing would affect you that you couldn't walk to in a day. Maybe a little bit more. Obviously, weather patterns are a little bit bigger than that, but you can see weather coming generally, 8 to 12 hours off. You also can remember some of the seasons, like, oh, hey, if it starts to get cold, we're at higher risk of snow. These things are very slow, very local and gradual changes. And the vast majority of our evolutionary heritage is based on this local and linear milieu where you're not aware of what's going on even 10 miles away, let alone 1,000 miles away. In point of fact, the kind of the range, the scope of what you could experience in one day. Now, there are, of course, some people that could travel much further than that, but the vast majority of people throughout most of human history were born, lived, and died within 10 miles of the same place. So wherever you were born, you probably did not travel more than 10 miles away from where you grew up. Now, obviously, some people were far more traveled throughout human history, going back even thousands of years, but that was very few people. The vast majority of people had a exclusively local influence. So if something didn't happen nearby, then it didn't really impact you. And this is one of the key things that underpins like our neurobiological failures is now we have the internet, which allows you to hear about news that's happening thousands of miles away on another continent in real time. there is pretty much no way that something happening on another continent or even another state is really going to affect you directly. But your brain doesn't know the difference. And so this is one of the key disparities is our technology has accelerated far beyond our evolution. And so your emotional intuition is not trustworthy in this particular context. So one way that this expresses is called normalcy bias. And so normalcy bias is basically that any changes that we experienced way back in the past were either gradual, so over very long periods of time, or temporary. So an example would be a flood comes through. Flood comes through because you had heavy rains, but then the landscape goes back to normal. Or maybe there was a forest fire. Fire burns down the forest, you run away, you come back, everything goes back to normal. And so this is also called anchoring. Although those are technically two slightly different things, I consider them more or less the same kind of bias. And it's not really a bias because, again, when you consider that the vast majority of human history, the landscape, the environment that you lived in would always pretty much go back to normal. And so we have a very hard time. We have no neural intuition for, hey, things are going to be fundamentally different a few years from now. And even if you have lived through change, and this is true particularly for older people, people in the boomer and the silent generation, they have lived through like massive technological change. And even though they have lived through it, even though they remember when TVs were all black and white and it was all radio, and now we have broadband internet and artificial intelligence, even people who have lived through it, they still get stuck in the normalcy bias that the way that things are right now is the way that it will always be forever and anon. And that is, again, because we do not have the evolutionary background. There was no incentive for evolution to give us the ability to understand on an intuitive level, on a gut check level, what it means that the world around you is changing constantly and it's changing permanently. The normalcy bias is one of the biggest problems. It's actually a bigger problem than I realized, because I've talked about normalcy bias on this channel before, but in abundance, Peter really emphasizes how much of a neurobiological failure this is, and that's why I'm making this video. So moving on, negativity bias. So this is something that I've also talked about, that plenty of people have talked about, but basically it is that negative information, bad news of any sort, is experienced 3 times or more intensely than good information. And again, there are very good evolutionary reasons for this because, way back in the day, if you were a villager and someone said, hey, there's probably someone spotted a tiger, there's a man-eater stalking the village, that captures your attention because if you're like, well, I don't really care about tigers, and you wander out into the woods to get some water or some firewood and you get eaten, guess what? You don't pass on those genes. And so we have a huge incentive to pay attention to local threats. And so this is why we have such a strong negativity bias, is its pure survival mechanism. But again, our brains did not evolve with the internet or even with mass media. And so your body responds is the same as though there's a tiger in your village when you hear about war happening on the other side of the planet or any bad news happening somewhere else, hundreds, thousands of miles away, that will never directly impact you. And so you have an emotional reaction, you have a very real emotional reaction and a physical reaction. It feels real to your body, even though you are never in any danger. This is why climate change is pushed the way that it is. And I'm not even a climate change denier. Yes, climate change is very real and it could be a threat, but who out there has actually experienced something profoundly negative from climate change? It is a boogeyman. Same thing as and all across the political spectrums, whether you're left, right, pro-Russian, anti-Russian, pro-American, anti-American, pro or anti-Israel, pro or anti-China, doesn't matter whatever your issue is. All sides of the political spectrum use negativity bias to amplify their signal. And so again, this is an exploitation. This is like a bug in our software. If you think about it like a video game, this is an exploit. This is something that has not been patched yet. And it is there for a reason, but we're no longer in an environment where you're about to get eaten on a daily basis. Now, if you're out hiking in California and there's mountain lions around, this negativity bias actually comes back into effect. I remember one time I was camping in Yosemite and it's like, oh yeah, here's a bear box. And it's like a steel like box that's bolted to the ground that you put all your food in so that if bears come to the campsite, they go to that instead of your tent. And I'm like, well, now I feel much less safe. That is what negativity bias is for. Negativity bias is not for social media. It's not for CNN and it's not for, Fox News or whatever. That's not what it evolved for. It evolved for there's a bear nearby. So speaking of social media is an expression of a few things, and in some respects, it is a good thing. It allows for the rapid spread of information, marketplace of ideas. Obviously, here I am. My entire career is on social media, so my living is based on social media. Lots of people, lots of my friends, they make a living based on social media. But it also comes with new risks and new affordances, namely the ability to spread information quickly. And if you're not aware of these neurobiological failures, if you just kind of give into the algorithm, you're going to get thirst traps, you're going to get rage bait, you're going to get anxiety and disgust inducing stuff. And honestly, like I think that there's some people in my comment section who are outraged when they watch me. And I don't really understand that because I'm here to like spread hope and optimism. And there are some just insanely angry people in the comments, and I'm like, do you just want to be angry? But again, and it's not necessarily their individual failure. If they're on social media and like the YouTube algorithm says, oh, hey, you engage with this kind of stuff, it's like the blind watchmaker. It doesn't really understand why you're engaging. It just says, hey, you're going to get a strong reaction from this. So if YouTube brought you to my channel and it makes you angry, like you don't have to watch me. Like I'm not here for you. Like I don't want to make people angry. I want to fight this problem. So if watching my content makes you angry, like you're welcome to unsubscribe if you want. I really don't care because there's lots of people who are aligned, who are here because they're optimistic and they want good news and they want to be, engaged with in a particular way. I feel for you. If the social media algorithm has manipulated you, like that sucks. And it is a huge platform with a lot of math and a lot of scientists operating behind it. Like the number of psychologists and mathematicians who are engineering the algorithms on Facebook and YouTube and everyone else to grab your attention and manipulate you, it is sickening. So, and then the other part is anonymity and trolls. So like there are lots and lots of trolls from Russia and China. And I don't mean like legit uses of free speech trolls. I mean state-sponsored people engaging in, black flag operations and manipulation. It is not a matter of free speech. It is a matter of like cyber warfare. It's basically a form of propaganda or warfare. And again, this is not something that your brain has evolved to understand intuitively. The idea that anyone that you're interacting with on the internet could be paid for by another country to manipulate you to destabilize your own country. Like this is far, far, far outside of anything that we experienced in our evolutionary history. We are not equipped to handle this on an emotional level or on an intuitive level. And then the news cycle. The news cycle is more or less the same thing. They figured it out a long time ago. I think the first time the mantra, if it bleeds, it leads. I think the first time that was used was in the 19th century. So the news cycle, and that was when it was still just paper, newspaper, because you see like what's on the front page. If it's a front page, it's like, Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. That was front page news. And the reason is because, again, these same neurobiological failures, or rather they were adaptive traits back in the day, but now they're maladaptive, is stuff that doesn't really affect you directly still gets your attention because, again, your brain doesn't really know the difference. And I kind of, it's all the same as social media, so I feel like I don't need to spend too much time belaboring the point. But if you do look at the news, just pay attention to how much news is negative versus how much is good. There's a reason that most news from mainstream news media is negative. And so this leads to a mantra that I learned a long time ago. It was in one of the books, many books that I've read on mental health. And this comes from both Zen meditation or Buddhist meditation, really, but also DBT, which is it's real but not true. And so basically, the emotions that you have in response to social media, in response to news, those are very real emotions. The phenomenon, the subjective experience, is a real phenomenon. It is a very real experience, but because of these neurobiological failures, it's not necessarily a reflection of objective reality. It's not reflecting on something that's true. And so this real but not true is a really important mantra to understand when, you see news and it's like, yes, I keep up with the news of stuff going on in Ukraine, in Israel, in China. Like that's part of my job here as a creator and communicator is to be aware of the news, but I'm also hyper cognizant of the fact that my brain and body are not evolved to really understand that on an intuitive level. I am not at risk of being invaded by Russia or China. And as horrible as many things are happening around the world, it does not affect me directly in my immediate bubble, in my immediate surroundings. And so because of that, even knowing that, even engaging with this stuff, after spending too much time like learning and reading about this stuff, I have to disconnect and just get away from the computer screens, which is one of the reasons that I've been making videos a little bit slower is because I'm really trying to practice what I preach and get outside more and get away from the internet as much as possible. So one thing is that many people are not aware of is the concept of a media diet. And so in this picture, we have, a typical American guy eating a rather typical American diet with lots of burgers and pasta and fries and other, delicious things. But what happens when you eat nothing but junk food all day? You are unhealthy. You either get fat or diabetic or, high blood pressure or all kinds of stuff. Media or information diet is no different. If you're constantly consuming the informational equivalent of junk food, then you're going to end up with the psychological equivalent of diabetes, of hypertension, of obesity. And that is outrage. That is being addicted to porn. That is all kinds of other bad things that you don't want. And the thing is every social media platform has these algorithms that are built in to get your attention and capture your attention. And so whatever your vulnerability is, whether you're predisposed to thirst traps or whether you're predisposed to anxiety or anger or whatever it is, those algorithms will find it and it will continuously feed you the bad stuff. So instead, how do you fix your real diet? You choose to eat more fruits and vegetables, more leafy greens, more lean meats, less processed foods. So what's the informational equivalent? What's the media equivalent of that? That is reading more books. That is getting off of social media. That is ignoring mainstream media. And that is curating your information diet with, with trusted podcasts, not stuff that is outrage inducing, so on and so forth. But the concept of a media diet and refining your media diet is critical. So getting into some recommendations. One, delete social media. I deleted LinkedIn, Facebook many years ago, Instagram, Reddit. I still use some of these things, but I don't have an account on any of them. And basically the reason is, even though I knew all of this, because this is something that I talk about with my wife a lot, this is actually part of her education, even knowing about these cognitive failures, even knowing that we have these cognitive biases and that the algorithms are out there, there is no amount of you cannot inoculate yourself against this. There is no vaccination against being manipulated if you use these platforms. The only way to really safeguard yourself is to not use them. Now, you might say okay, this is really weird coming from a YouTuber because again, my entire livelihood is based on this. So what I will say is that in many cases, you can curate your feed. You can block certain sources. So if I see any websites or channels or whatever that are outrage inducing, that are anxiety inducing, that use certain things to manipulate you, spread misinformation, whatever, they all have a block button. They have mute and block, and I remove news sources from my Google News feed. I just say, you know what? This is no longer a reliable source. I don't want to see it anymore. And that is the best way to curate your media feed. Now, I can hear some of you saying, well, yeah, but that's what angry boomers who watch Fox News do is they'd say, I don't trust anything other than, Fox News and OAN or whatever, the talking heads are on that side of it. And that's true. And that is also their right. And this is why it's a little bit harder to navigate, but I do have another solution in just a minute to recommend. But ignoring mainstream news, I remember a few years ago, probably about 10 years ago when Tumblr was still a big thing, and I was still very much in internet debate land, and I had older people say, oh, you need to stop getting all your news from Tumblr and MSNBC, and I was like, I don't use Tumblr, and I don't watch MSNBC, and they're like, well, where do you get your information from? News aggregators. So, news aggregators, offbeat news, RSS feeds, other sources, because I've always had a little bit better of a understanding of media diet and information diet. But even still, it's just, I mean, it's an uphill battle. It's a Sisyphean task to fight the machine of social media and mainstream news. So yeah, just ignore it. Like when I go to the gym, oh man. So when I go to the gym, they have like, Fox News and CNN and MSNBC all up on the TVs. The amount of just outrage and anger and pain that they are constantly sharing, like, good Lord, no wonder we're so anxious and depressed, because on Fox News, it's like, oh, you have like these 18 diseases and here's a pill that'll fix them, but it'll also give you like kidney ulcers or whatever. I'm like, the people who watch Fox News must be abjectly miserable and angry all the time just because of how much pain and hate comes from those channels. And CNN isn't much better because it's like, oh, hey, teenager was burned alive by the police over in, Winchester or whatever. And I'm like, this is not a healthy way of engaging with the world. So one thing that I will recommend is use Perplexity. Now, this is not a sponsored thing, but I have had issues with Perplexity in the past. It has gotten better. What I will say is that Perplexity does still have some problems. Namely, if the scientific consensus says one thing, it will double down on that time and again, and will not allow for any room for deviation from that, which of course will make some people angry. An example was I was asking Perplexity about burnout versus adrenal fatigue. And I said, okay, go find the symptoms and the pathophysiology of burnout. And it said, oh, this is an HPA axis disorder. Okay, cool. What about adrenal fatigue? And it's like, oh, adrenal fatigue, that's pseudoscience. And I'm like, what's the pathophysiology of it? HPA axis disorder. And it's like, it's not the same thing though. One is bunk pseudoscience and the other is recognized by the ICD-11. And I'm like, okay, but they're the same thing. And it just refused to engage with you. So again, there are some things that I would do differently with Perplexity. But at the same time, as I'm engaging with the comments section, people share stuff that I find skeptical or that I don't believe. And more often than not, I will say, okay, hey, I'll go over to Perplexity and I say, someone had this comment on my video and this is what the video is about. Is there any truth to this? And sometimes I was wrong. But it's so fast. It's so much faster now than it used to be. So getting information from Perplexity where you have this more balanced approach, where it has some built-in media literacy. Now, again, even as someone who is trained to recognize misinformation and understand the failures of the establishment, it's not perfect. No source of information is perfect, but this is far and away a much better source of information than any single website, particularly on more contentious issues. And then finally, touch grass. I remember I was sitting on a podcast a while ago, and someone was like, "Well, how do we defeat this juggernaut? How do we overcome Moloch and AI enabled misinformation?" I was like, just disengage, play a different game. No one is forcing you to be in front of a screen. No one is forcing you to use social media. You can disconnect from all of this and just go outside. And again, that is something that I have been trying to practice what I preach. And I've been spending a lot more time outside, getting back in better shape and so on and so forth. And I would encourage everyone to do the same thing. But basically, like, if it comes from a screen, like, I don't want to say don't trust anything that the screen tells you. But at the same time, if you're using screens, like, it is very well established science that as screen time use goes up, so does anxiety, depression, and anger, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So I have all kinds of stuff on my phone. Like, I keep it in grayscale. I have the digital wellness. So like, I try and keep my phone use to under an hour every day. Sometimes I get down to like 30 minutes. And guess what? Those days they tend to be better. So thanks for watching. I hope you got a lot out of this. The whole purpose of this is, whatever people are telling you that's anxiety inducing about AI and climate change and whatever else, like, yes, you can scrutinize it, engage with the data, but also just keep all of this other stuff in mind as you engage with it and consider making some structural changes to your life. You will feel better for it. I know that I certainly have now that I have deleted most social media. So thanks for watching.